Hey folks, this is Marilee at Super Soul Solutions, and I thank you for joining in today to our show, Are You Afraid of Death or Dying? If you are, my longtime dear friend and special guest, near-death expert, Dan Drasin, will put your mind to rest about that. Pun intended. Dan Drasin has been a media producer and documentary filmmaker since the early 1960s. As a child, he experienced many precognitive dreams, which stimulated his early interest in paranormal phenomena. And as an adult, Dan witnessed a number of UFO sightings and was one of the main on-site researchers of the infamous West Virginia Mothman incident in the late 1960s, which they later did a film about with Richard Gere. Since 1993, Dan has been probing various aspects of the afterlife, including near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, life between lives, and reincarnation. Dan's personal experiences include communications from his late partner, Jane, as well as from his late father, both of which included highly evidential phenomena and information. So, Dan, with that, let's get started and jump right in.
All right.
Would you please start by explaining to our listeners what you mean when you talk about the word afterlife?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that because I don't like the word. I think the word afterlife is too limiting. I think it's actually misleading. We think of our physical lives as the real thing, and the afterlife, that's kind of something tacked onto the end, like you pin the tail on the donkey, right? The donkey is the real thing, and there's a little thing you tack on at the end.
Yeah.
But I don't think it works that way at all. I think that what we call the afterlife, for lack of a better term, is really the greater reality. It's where we come from, it's where we go back to, and we make these purposeful excursions into incarnation for whatever purposes we're pursuing on a higher level. And coming into this field of limitation gives us particular tools and a particular focus to work on our own, what people call soul growth, development of certain faculties, developing a deeper understanding of this entire amazing system that we live within. The nature of human interaction has its own special qualities that don't exist out there in the greater reality, because the greater reality, you might say, works by a more alive set of rules, a more flexible set of rules, less constrained set of rules. Here in the physical, things are more focused and more limited, and our ability to learn to navigate and operate within those limitations provides experiences that we simply can't have when all these restrictions are removed. So that's one way of looking at it. So what we call the afterlife is also the before life.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the during life. Our consciousness, as it exists right now in our bodies, is still not of our bodies. Our materialistic sciences, and by the way, I'm very much pro-science, but there's this overlay of materialism that has sort of weighed very heavily on the whole scientific enterprise for 400 years. It has nothing to do with the scientific method. So I think if you start looking scientifically, which simply means carefully and systematically, at our own present experience, we find that our consciousness, and this is objectively verified in any number of ways, our consciousness is not simply what's produced by the activities of our brain. And the brain does not generate consciousness. It's an interface between our consciousness and our bodies, of course, and brain deficits will obviously produce problems, with our perception and our ability to navigate in our bodies. But the consciousness itself, that which experiences our day-to-day reality, experiences our brain deficits when they occur. That's beyond the body. So you might say that why be afraid of death because we're already dead?
Yes.
In this sense.
I always like to say you can't die even if you tried.
Right. That's very well put. Right. But even within our lives, within our daily lives, if we realize that our awareness itself is already on the other side, as it were, it's part of the greater reality, then it's easier to see how physical death does not extinguish that. That goes on. It's always gone on and will continue to go on. Which is not to say that we can solve our problems by committing suicide or murder or whatever. That's a whole different set of questions. But the very fact of consciousness is, in its own way, proof of the afterlife, or whatever term you want to use. Anyway, that's how I've come to see it and how I've come to experience it in my life.
I just watched a 2-hour special on the latest, I think it's called Evidence of the Soul. And these are, shall we say, curious scientists, but not really wanting to quite jump to the consciousness level, doing all kinds of experiments. And they're saying, well, it appears to be in the field around the body, and we can measure it magnetically. They're not quite ready to do the jump yet into,
I think we have to recognize also that even in straight materialist science, scientists talk about, well, if we can't measure an energy, it's not real. Well, it doesn't quite wash on a couple of levels. Number one, that would presuppose that we have devised all the possible instrumentation that can measure all energies, and we obviously haven't.
Fairly arrogant, right?
Right. So that's one level of it. And the other thing is that when science measures energies, it's not really measuring the energies to begin with. It's measuring how energies act on certain things that we do know, right? You measure a gravitational field or a magnetic field.
Good point.
You're measuring those fields' action on, say, physical bodies.
Effect.
Right. We're measuring the effect, because that's all we can do. The actual nature of a magnetic field or gravitational field is completely immaterial. There's no substance to it. There is no space, time, or matter around it. There's only energy or force. So when we talk about science's interaction with these things, we need to use a lighter touch and realize that science is fine. It's important, it's necessary, and that it can at times sort of devolve into a religion based on certain assumptions that are never questioned. So in the realm of afterlife research, for example, there are many, many, many avenues of research, some of which provide surprisingly concrete evidence of the existence of an afterlife.
Give me examples of that.
Well, my favorite example, and the one that I've done the most research on, is called instrumental transcommunication. And that's a fancy word for afterlife communication through electronics.
Now, Dan has a movie called Calling Earth that is on Vimeo, and he is kind enough to offer that free to everyone around that,
Right.
Don't you?
Right. I'll mention the link a little later.
Okay.
I just want to give a little history of this. Back in the 1950s, when tape recorders first became consumer items, people occasionally noticed that voices showed up on the tapes that didn't belong there. And in the United States particularly, this was noticed, but people thought, oh, well, maybe the machine's picking up a radio station or something like that, and nothing ever happened with it. But in Europe, a number of researchers started taking this seriously as a phenomenon that deserved to be investigated. The pioneer there was a man named Friedrich Jürgensen, who was a Swedish artist and filmmaker and singer, very well known in his time. He was out one night with his tape recorder recording nocturnal bird sounds for a documentary. And when he played back the tape, in addition to the bird sounds, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds.
Whoa!
Now this was,
how fun is that?
And he thought, at first he thought, this is quite a coincidence. The machine must have been picking up a radio discussion about nocturnal bird sounds. Then, not long after that, on one of his tapes, he heard the voice of his mother calling him by his childhood nickname, Friedel. So at that point, he sort of threw up his hands and said, look, we need to investigate this scientifically. So he devoted the rest of his life to researching this phenomenon, and he recorded thousands of these voices.
Of people who are departed, quote unquote, but are communicating through, like, what devices?
Well, in his case, it was the tape recorder.
Okay.
That was the technology of the time. And he simply focused his mind on it. He knew it was possible because it had happened. And once he knew it was possible, he was able to start experimenting. He would roll the tape ask a question, let the tape roll for a while, ask another question, so on and so on. And then he'd just wind the tape back and play the tape, and he would find that in those silent sections, there would be meaningful answers to his questions. Sometimes the voices were very faint, but they were definitely there.
You know, yes. This is a little sideways to the subject, but reverse speech.
This is something I haven't really looked into. One of the reasons I haven't is that I've tried to avoid the areas of research where people can project their own thoughts and beliefs and hopes and so on. So I try to stick with the hardest evidence and the evidence that's the most obvious, that you can't simply discard. So this electronic voice phenomenon, which is what came to be known as, turned out to be a legitimate subject of research in Europe. Others took it up. A man by the name of Konstantin Raudova, a Latvian professor and psychologist who was an associate of Jurgensen for a while, did his own experimenting. And by the time he died in 1974, he had recorded between 60 and 70,000 of these voice samples.
Wow!
He put out an LP record at the time that included many samples of these voices. And you can hear those in my film. I included that in my film.
Yes, I loved your film.
And he was sort of the grand poobah of this, this experimentation. There were others. A German fellow by the name of Klaus Schreiber. He was trained as a saddlesmith, knew nothing about technology. But he started experimenting with this electronic voice phenomenon. And a deceased relative of his came through his tape recorder and said, "Why don't you try experimenting with video?" He knew nothing about video, but he tried experimenting. He got some assistance from an engineer, so he built a system that seemed to work. He got amazing images of historical figures, of dead relatives of his, including his own son. He had a very difficult life. He lost, I think, 8 of his close relatives in a matter of very few years. And that was one of his motives for doing this experimentation. So
is this similar to photos when you see ghosts in the background on photos and things like that? Is that how it shows up in the videos, or does it show up more tangible in the videos?
Well, you can see it in my film.
Yeah.
And that will answer your question and perhaps other questions about that. He produced quite a number of these very interesting images and videos. And there are other experimenters in Europe that worked along the same lines. So this has been established as a very solid phenomenon that you really can't debunk once you really look into it. There are people who do this in the privacy of their own homes. A friend of mine who's in the film, Vicki Talbot, lives up in Washington State, and her son Braden passed away in early 2001 in a kayaking accident with his friend Jim up in Bellingham Bay. And Braden, the son, started coming through to other people through their tape recorders who had an association called the Big Circle, which is an association of parents who had lost their children. And she found out about this. As it turned out, Braden had been coming through these other moms' tape recorders for a while. So Vicki decided she would start doing this practice. And Braden came through like gangbusters, and he still is to this day. You can hear some of their first communications in my film, which are quite fascinating.
So we're talking, now I watched your film about a year ago, but we're talking that it comes through tape recorders, voice recorders, television, videos, phones,
answering machines, and as you'll see in my film, and just about every common electronic device. Cell phone recorders, cell phones themselves, and phone calls. There's really no limit to how this can occur if the conditions are right. And those conditions would include an interest on the part of the practitioner on this side, and that on the other side as well. From what we understand, it takes a lot more energy for them to come through to a physical device than it does, say, to come through an accomplished medium.
That's what I heard, too. Yeah. I was going to ask you, without getting into super science about it, the kind of general science around it? Is it an electric thing, electromagnetic thing, or it just takes a lot of focus to?
We don't have the language for it. It's true in a lot of these areas. Our scientific language serves us very well in the areas that we understand. Beyond that, we're really stuck with metaphors. And language is a kind of a minefield in these areas because we're dealing with a lot of traditional language, religious language, cultural language, different national languages have different thought patterns connected with them. And some cultures that have a deep immersion in this sort of thing will have a wider range of language and be able to make subtler distinctions. We here in the English-speaking world, we don't have a whole lot of subtle distinctions. So we have, we do the best we can with it.
Right.
In the fields of mediumship and so on, the language is evolving a little bit. But we really need to be careful. Whatever words we use will bring up our everyday associations with them. So we just need to cut ourselves some slack in that area and realize that however articulately we can speak about any of this, it's just an approximation.
Good point, Dan. Okay, let's get right in because you brought up Brandon. Is his name? Braden.
Yes.
Okay, so her son. So you were saying that you have to. These are my words. Have to be a powerful or strong or focused spirit to get it through a technical device, such as the tape recorders that they had. And so why don't you share with the audience some of the news from the other side? Instead of from down under, from up above.
What kind of news do you have in mind?
Well, what do you think the afterlife is like, and why should we care about it?
Well, why we should care about it, I think, is fairly obvious, because we're all going to get there sooner or later, right? What it's like, let's look at our own earthly lives. Our lives are what we make them, to a great extent. And I think that's true in the afterlife as well. And all of the communications and information that we have, I think, lead us in that direction. That in a realm that you might say is made out of consciousness, we can create our own reality to a greater extent than we can here in the body. Here, we create our own reality in the sense of what we make of things, what we notice. You and I could go into your living room, say, spend 30 seconds there and come out and compare notes about what we saw. I would have seen a room full of furniture. You would have a life. Being female. You would have a lifetime of association with everything in that room.
Right, the memories and stuff, yeah.
So apart from just our raw sensory impressions, what we make of reality has a lot to do with our emotional connection with things and people, what our purposes are. We can walk into a room and have some purpose on our mind, and we'll find the thing in that room that serves that purpose. You might walk in the same room, have a completely different purpose, be focused on something completely different, and have, what was in that room? Oh, well, X was in that room. And you might say, no, Y was in that room.
Right. So are you saying afterlife is the same thing? It's a result of, expectations, projections? What would you say?
I would say yes, but in a more intense way than here, in the sense. As in dreams. Dreams and memory are an example of our everyday experiences or every night experiences that have some parallels with what we understand the experience of the afterlife is. It's a more flexible reality. It will conform, the projection that we make of reality will conform to a greater extent to our expectations, right? Like, again, going back to the metaphor of you and I going into a living room, we both agree that there's a living room and it's laid out in more or less the same way. Interesting experiments have been done with, for example, lucid dreamers. Dreaming and lucid dreaming are, you might say, a half step toward what we call the afterlife. Two lucid dreamers can meet in a dream, have a conversation, awaken, and continue that conversation. So what does that tell us? But each of their memories of the dream, like what clothing they were wearing, would differ. So the projected reality...
Depending on our fantasies.
Right, right. Fantasies, desires, wishes, aversions, whatever it is. Right. So the window dressing, right, the outer appearance of things is more of a projection, a personal projection. But the essence of things, you might say the invisible part of it, like the two souls meeting in that dream, those are real, more real than the projections. The projections are in a way just a kind of convenience, a way for us to recognize,
relate,
to recognize and relate. Yes, but the farther inward you go into the nature of being, the less fixed or identifiable form there is.
We're malleable. Right.
So it's sometimes an important convenience to be able to create a form around something. And in the afterlife, as we understand it, birds of a feather flock together. People of a certain culture or profession or inclination will tend to live, at least in the early stages of the afterlife, in what I call a bubble, a mutually created consensus reality that's functional for them. Some will be more or less recreations of the life they knew or the community that they knew, and there will be people in that community who are, say, architects, who will help you create your own house in that bubble. And it works. It serves its purpose. It's not the whole truth. It's not the whole...
It's kind of a transition phase, right?
That is very much what it appears to be. And in communications from that part of the afterlife, mostly through mediums, we understand that some people will go on for ages and ages in those bubbles. Others will know that there's more to explore.
Well, of course, then you have the time factor not existing particularly.
Right. It's a time, the further you get from, say, earthly form, the less time means anything. Now, in these particular bubbles, you might say, there's a sort of a consensus passage of time. It's not as fixed as the tick-tock time we use here in our physical world. There aren't the motions of the planets and our clocks and so on that we're tied to, but there is a general consensus about what is experienced as the passage of time. So it's not an either-or thing.
It's kind of like half here, half there in a certain way, so that you get to transition smoothly, and most of these people are creating a beautiful environment. And is this why there seems to be, in the studies I've done, planes of existence where there's these archetypes, like you were saying, where there's a plane where there's temples of white alabaster,
Right, with 27 virgins. Right. And this is not to make fun of any particular religion or spiritual point of view. There is this variety. If you are attracted to, say, a particular form of Buddhism, and you spend years in that environment, that discipline, it would be expected that when you pass over, that the environment you find yourself in would have characteristics
would be conducive
that reflect that particular worldview, as it were. So coming full circle with this, yes, the afterlife is what we make it. And why we make it what we make it is, I think, the real question. What inner work are we pursuing here on Earth and in various stages of the afterlife? And that, too, apparently turns out to be a very individual thing. No two souls apparently are identical. They all have different abilities, proclivities, desires, aversions, and I think that's part of
That's the point.
That's the point, right? That's part of the greater picture of why is there variety to begin with, and I imagine that
Source likes to play with itself.
Sure, you can put it that way.
I never said that.
An infinite variety of ways to play with yourself, right? Right. Because what else is there to do,
And isn't well, maybe too simplistic, but isn't the general impetus in a certain linear perspective is maximum soul growth?
We hear this over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It's
and
just kind of
the soul, the quasi-individualized thing that we call a soul, has its own unique ways in which it wants to advance and grow. And the common denominator, yes, it's what we call soul growth, but your soul growth and my soul growth might not look quite the same.
You can say that, I just high-fived him, folks.
And that's true.
He's the better version of me.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Marilee and I are old friends. I think that's coming through here very well. What else would you like to explore?
Bryant was his name again? Bryant, the son? Braden. Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's an uncommon name.
Braden. What were they saying? Like, what was the message? Did they want to go, hey, Mom, I'm fine. Life is real. Don't worry about it. Have some fun. Eat a lot of ice cream. Whatever.
Well, there's some of that. But the main message, and their most repeated message, was, Mom, I love you.
Aww. Yeah.
And that went both ways. They were very close, and they remain close to this day. And Vicky's learned a lot about the nature of the afterlife through these communications.
Absolutely. So is that the main message in general? I guess it can depend, because I've heard of inventors being really frustrated about not having something come forward, so they're trying to bring it through. So I guess there could be all kinds of agendas. But is the major one is to put at peace people and to give them a sense of connection and that life goes on and sharing truth? Or is there like common themes?
Well, almost by definition, any of these communications imply that life goes on. That message
if you think they're real, yeah.
Right, if you think they're real.
Yes.
And if you hang out with these various realms of evidence, I don't think anyone could really deny the reality of this. You can avoid looking at the evidence and say, I don't believe it.
Right.
But once you really immerse yourself in it, I think the answer is self-evident.
I agree, which takes me to the question of, you mentioned in the bio that you earlier in your life had a lot of paranormal experiences. So why don't you share, if you would, what brought you to these studies and what occurred for you?
Well, this actually started when I was very young. As a young child, I had quite a few precognitive dreams that tended to come true in one way or another the next day, often. And I didn't understand this, but what it told me was that stuff went on backstage. In other words, that the life that I knew in my waking life was not the whole picture.
And is there a script or not?
No, I didn't get that far. At the age of 4 or 5.
Oh, was that young?
Yeah, but it was enough to let me know that stuff went on behind the scenes. There was a behind the scenes. And later on, as I grew up, I became really interested in things that aren't supposed to happen but would happen anyway, like the whole UFO phenomenon and all the many phenomena connected with that. I became really interested in that for many years.
And is that because, as you mentioned in the bio, that you saw some? What triggered that for you?
Well, I'm not sure what triggered it for me, but I did become interested in that whole question. I read everything that was available at the time, which was not very much. Began to learn a little bit about the politics of it, that this was a phenomenon that mainstream science and government and so on could not explain. And they were concerned about it kind of getting out of control because they're in the business of control and also of reassurance of the public. So, I sort of joined the UFO subculture, as it were, people who were investigating these things. And yes, there was some nonsense that went on in that community as well. But I tried to stick to the most compelling evidence that I could find. For me, that included having witnessed a number of UFO sightings. And
how old were you about this time?
Well, this took place over a period of years, probably from my mid-late adolescence through my 20s and 30s and 40s. In connection with that, one of my most interesting experiences was an involvement in the so-called Mothman investigation.
Yeah.
This was the result of...
That's John Keel's?
John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, was the product of his investigation. He spent quite a bit of time in the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which was the sort of epicenter of these phenomena. This was back in the late 60s, and John was a friend of mine, and he invited me to come along on his investigations. And so it was my first exposure to what's called high strangeness. I had a couple of, I would say, minor experiences myself there, but I also got to meet a lot of people who were obviously very sane, ordinary folks who were confronting these events that they couldn't explain, including UFO sightings, which occurred regularly around the town, and the appearance of this non-human entity, which they dubbed the Mothman. It was a winged creature about 7 feet tall, which could levitate, could also fly with its wings, and had the habit of scaring the hell out of people and sometimes following their cars at 90 miles an hour along the main highway north of Point Pleasant.
And red eyes, right? Wasn't that reported?
Not just red eyes, but glowing eyes,
glowing eyes.
You know,
wow.
Right out of
radiation.
right out of a bad science fiction movie. But these people were consistently reporting this creature. I spoke to some private pilots in the local airport, and they had seen it. One guy said, "Yeah, I saw this thing. I thought it was some small plane, and when I got close to it, oh my God, it was a creature." So, and this is, salt of the earth guy who had no reason to make this stuff up. And this is, one of many pieces of testimony that convinced me that this is quite a real thing. And as you probably know, John Keel's book was loosely adapted into the Richard Gere movie called the Mothman Prophecies.
They left a lot out, though.
They left most of it out.
Yes.
Basically, an excuse for a love story.
Yes.
But they got the part about the bridge collapse right. I actually walked across that bridge a week before it went down, and it was scary because the bridge was. For those who don't know the story, in December of 1967, this bridge, major traffic artery over the Ohio River, collapsed into the river just before Christmas. The bridge had been built back in the 20s. It was built for 1920s traffic, and here it was the 60s. There was a lot of heavy trucks and rush hour traffic going over it. And one component of the bridge that had not been
updated.
It was in the original manufacture of it. There was a crack, and they determined this afterward. And this crack grew over a period of 40 years and finally gave out on this one night. It was a tragedy. There wasn't a person in the town who didn't know someone who had been killed in that tragedy.
Now, what is the relationship to the Mothman sightings in that?
Okay, the Mothman sightings started about a year and a half before the bridge went down. Some people have theorized that the Mothman was trying to issue a warning because after the bridge went down, it was never seen again in that area. The UFO sightings stopped. Other paranormal phenomena that were occurring, they stopped cold after the bridge went down. So
that's kind of interesting.
It is. I mean, maybe there was other.
I wonder if there's like a fractal or tear in space or portal or something.
Well, that area has had a history of being a hot spot for interesting phenomena.
Yeah, that's what I'm picking up right now.
Going back many years.
Like kind of a portal for things coming in and out?
Yes, possibly. There are legends about a Native American curse having to put on the land near there, and all kinds of other stories. It's really impossible to track down any of its details. But the bottom line is that area of the Central Ohio Valley does have a history of weird things going on. Mm-hmm. And that's something that some intrepid author and researcher should go do sometime, because my impression was that it was a very rich history in that way. So that was probably at least an element of what was going on there.
Okay, well, that's a little side story that is pretty fascinating. So what got you interested in the afterlife in particular? Was it a personal loss, a sorrow? What got you into that?
It's actually the books of Robert Monroe. Monroe had been a radio executive and also a producer and director in the 1950s. And he, at one time, started having spontaneous out-of-body experiences. And I thought he was going crazy, had a battery of psychiatric tests run on him, perfectly clean bill of health. So what's going on? Well, a psychiatrist friend of his happened to mention that, hey, you know, what you're experiencing, in other cultures, they consider it a talent, and it's something you can develop. So Monroe picked up that challenge and proceeded to develop this talent. He developed methods and approaches for inducing out-of-body experiences, for navigating in these other realms, and eventually for teaching them to others.
That was in Virginia, right?
Yes, he founded the Monroe Institute in Charlottesville, Virginia, which teaches these techniques and which still exists. And I had...
Did you train with him?
I spent a week at the Institute back in 93, 94, and while he was still alive, so I got to meet him, and that was a pleasure. Next thing happened was I met a man by the name of Mark Macy, who you will also see in my film. Mark is a writer, lives near Boulder, Colorado, where I happened to be living at the time, and he had just written a book about instrumental transcommunication, this electronic voice phenomenon, communication through video, and so on. I had just sort of vaguely heard about it at that point, and I was actually pretty skeptical about it.
And by the way, folks, this is just a familiar thing. All Dan's friends and professionals, we all send him a photograph when we think it's something paranormal or some unusual phenomena. And Dan is sophisticated enough and understands science and light and technology enough that we rely on him to go, no, sorry, folks, this is a fake, or things like that. So he's very good at discerning.
I like to think so. My long experience in photography and visual and audio media have given me a pretty good sense of what's what. So getting back to Mark Macy, I was skeptical at first. But after he exposed me to the history of this phenomenon, to a lot of the material, I became really, really interested. So around 2000, 2001, I embarked on a documentary production about this. I started by accompanying Mark himself to some sessions on the East Coast where he was practicing a particular form of paranormal photography that was producing very interesting results.
Now, did this pop up with digital photography?
No.
This was before digital photography.
These are equal opportunity phenomena that don't seem to care what medium you're using. Right?
Okay.
A lot of this happened with film cameras before it happened with digital cameras. In fact, the work that Mark was doing was with ordinary Polaroid cameras, where you shoot the picture and the print comes out and develops in a minute. So that was interesting. Then I started inquiring in other areas. I started working with a friend of mine, Tim Coleman, as a co-producer. We traveled around the States, England, Scotland, and Spain for 4 or 5 years, documenting the phenomena, the practitioners of the phenomena, and even some conferences. There was a big conference in Spain in 2004, an international conference on this subject.
Now, when you're saying phenomena, are we talking specific afterlife communication, or are we talking different kinds of phenomena on the other side, like light forms, ghosts, whatever? What are we talking about?
Primarily communications.
Okay.
And that's really the focus of my documentary. You could make 1,000 documentaries going off in different directions, and there have been some good ones made. I just stumbled on one a few weeks ago, a Canadian documentary whose name I will give you later. You can find it on YouTube. And it had an excellent sequence on the Leininger case.
Oh, yes.
This involved a child.
Little boy.
Yes.
Was this
Leininger.
one of Dr. Ian Stevenson's?
No.
Okay,
no.
It's another.
This was investigated by Jim Tucker,
amazing.
who was Stevenson's
the pilot.
successor. Yes. This young boy, James Leininger, grew up in Louisiana, I believe. As an infant, was inconsolable. He cried all the time. His parents were obviously concerned about this, didn't know what to do. The doctors didn't know what to do. As soon as he could express himself in any way, before he learned how to talk, he would do drawings of airplanes, and particularly of airplanes being shot down in war. And at that time, he also had a series of nightmares, constant nightmares, actually, in which he felt that he was inside of an airplane and couldn't get out. His mother really accepted this first as a possibility. Father was more religiously oriented and more skeptical, but he had to come around at a certain point where, for example, he took young James to an aviation museum, and James pointed out the airplane that he used to fly as a pilot in the Second World War, pointed out everything about that plane, and he's like, 6 or 7 years old at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, it became obvious that he had in his past life been a pilot who was shot down over the Sea of Japan and had flown out of a particular aircraft carrier whose name he partially remembered. Mm-hmm. He called it the Natoma. The ship turned out to be actually the Natoma Bay was its full title. And there was a reunion of the survivors of that campaign in the Second World War who had served aboard that aircraft carrier. So they brought young James to this reunion where he apparently recognized
his old buddies
by name. They also tracked down his sister in the former life and introduced the two, and they'd become good friends. If you look into the work of Ian Stevenson, who did a lot of work, for example, in India, which is a culture that accepts this sort of thing, and so the information is much more freely available. This became a very sort of common pattern where when the child was introduced to his former family, the former family sort of adopted the child as a niece or a nephew, as it were.
Sometimes they'd go to take him to their the house, and the little boy or girl would go running into their room and recognize it and all that, and they'd go, "Where'd you put the?"
Exactly. And you can't make this stuff up.
So, and it usually, two questions here. This is what I heard. Don't know if it's correct. Is that the memories stay, and then they tend to start fading, at least in the past, with the young children once they're verbal. Pretty much by 6 or 7, they start forgetting that kind of stuff. Is that true?
That seems to be the pattern. And part of that is that the age of 7 is where the mind starts to come in and function in a more grown-up way. And this tends to displace or push aside these deeper memories and impressions. In the case of James Leininger, he retained his memories till a later age, partly because of all the attention that had been focused on it. ABC Television did a number of features on him. But to me, the most touching part of the story is that they took him out on a boat in the Sea of Japan to the exact spot where he'd been shot down. And he threw a bouquet of flowers into the water at that time. And that gave him closure. At that point, he was able to put the whole story behind him. And
compartmentalize, like, now he's in this life.
Right.
Rather than, I'm living these 2 lives and I'm still traumatized by how I recently died.
Yeah. So he's looking forward now. He's in his teens now. He wants to become an Air Force pilot.
Yeah, big surprise. How do you think?
I wish him luck.
How do they get all those guys signing up for Top Guns, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So
you think he'd learn his lesson?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, God bless him, and I wish him luck. Anyway, that's his story. But there's so many stories when you start to look into this.
Now, do you want to share? I saw little tears well up in your eyes on that story. Would you like to share any personal experiences you've had with beloved departed ones?
Right. Well, my partner Jane, who I lived with for 11 years, passed away in 2007. She herself was a bit of a channeler, so she was already kind of out there and accepted a lot of this to begin with. And not long after she passed, I began to have some interesting physical impressions, particularly a sort of tingling on the right side of my head, on the top. And it was something I hadn't experienced before. But when it happened, at first it didn't mean anything to me. And then I realized that when I experienced this tingling in the head, I also had a feeling of her presence. And this culminated one evening. I was just in the kitchen doing the dishes one night, and it was as if she was standing next to me. Mm. It was the strangest feeling because I couldn't see her with my physical eyes, but I could feel her next to me.
The whole imprint was there.
The whole imprint was there. I could practically smell her.
Whoa, yeah.
That kind of thing. I was almost shocked by this, and then I started laughing and kind of blew her a kiss. It was unmistakably her. So, and there have been other things like that with Jane. We had been very close, and I've also had some communications from her through a couple of very accomplished mediums, and that's meant a lot to me as well. So
I was going to ask you, what does near-death experiencers and afterlife communication reveal that is different, number one, and also when so you were describing how it comes through electronic information and photos and different instrumentation, but then we're getting a lot of communication, as most people know, through mediums. Mm-hmm. And I assume the audience knows what mediums are and channeling are. So,
well, just to go back a step to the question of near-death experiences, again, as your audience probably knows, many, many people have, since the middle of the 20th century when medicine became able to resuscitate people that would otherwise remain dead, people started reporting these very interesting, detailed, coherent experiences that took place while their bodies were flatlined for considerable periods of time. They were able to report on their physical surroundings, which they shouldn't have been able to do, being flatlined in the ER, say, and then also able to report what was going on down the hall and around the corner, which was later verified. So that was strange enough. Mm-hmm. And then they would also report having traveled into what we would think of as the afterlife, this realm where they had ranges of experience that they could not have in their physical bodies, in their physical lives. Now, the reports from these experiences differ from most reports through mediums about the afterlife in this way. The near-death experiencer will often report going up level after level after level. A good analogy might be a multi-story building where we're normally living in the basement of the first floor. And they might ascend up to the second, third, fourth, fifth floor and end up on the roof where there's no walls, mm-hmm. right? No differentiation, no limits.
So their consciousness is transitioning.
Right. Their consciousness is without limits. They're up at the top level. And then they come bouncing back down into their bodies. They may awaken spontaneously, or they may, in some cases, they're given the choice of whether to come back or not. In some cases, they are told in no uncertain terms, you're not done, back you go. And in a few cases, they're given the choice of coming back into their, say, damaged bodies or coming back into a newly born child. Mm. And I know one person in particular who chose to come back into her damaged body because she felt she had work to do and to continue here. So that's the NDE side of it. On the afterlife communication side, we find that these communications tend to come from one level, the level at which the soul or the spirit is at the time of communication.
Don't lose that train of thought, but I've heard of something about wait 3 months of our time till someone transitions and kind of more solidifies before you begin communication. Is there any truth to that at all?
And this is something that I've been told by certain mediums. A friend of mine passed. I consulted the medium. They said, not yet. Mm. They're still working out their stuff, mm-hmm. still getting consolidated there. In a few other cases, I haven't had to wait that long. Mm-hmm. One friend of mine passed over last year, and she reported in immediately to a friend of mine who's a medium who then called me. Mm-hmm. So, again, it's a highly individual question. In the case of this friend I just mentioned, she had prepared herself very well for her transition. She'd done a lot of her spiritual homework, as it were. So she was able to come in, at least in a limited way, right away. And then after some period of time, she checked in with a more complete message. So again, it's what you make it. It's individual, as it is here on Earth.
And it does seem that if you prepare early for whatever that is and contemplate and study and things like that, sometimes the transition's easier and you have less of what we call time to acclimate to the whole thing and to move on to higher levels.
Right, and we're told that one of the features of the afterlife, and it also takes place in near-death experiences, is what's called the life review, where you get to evaluate yourself, your interactions with other people, you get to experience what they experienced in interaction with you, and so on. And one of the most interesting pieces of advice I've gotten recently is start your life review now.
Yes.
Get a head start on it.
Yeah.
And while we may not be able to be as penetrating in that life review while we're in the body, the desire to make that head start, I think, can make a difference.
The intent.
Yeah.
And how would that look, for instance, is like look at regrets or examine who you still need to forgive and what do I have to think or feel differently in order to no longer suffer, things like that.
Right, and the forgiveness is really about oneself.
Usually is, yeah.
You're letting go of a big chunk of energy there in doing that. So to whatever extent we can do it, that kind of self-examination before we pass over, I think can be helpful and useful.
That's a great idea. I'm going to bring up a couple examples I'm sure everyone's heard about. And Nicole, the producer, as all of you know, of News for the Soul, I believe, if I have my story right, that she started off with a pretty famous near-deather, Daniel Brinkley, who's quite a character. And when I met him at a live talk about 20 years ago, oh, my God, he totally cracked me. He was someone who decided to come back, like you were talking about, Dan, instead of going into a little body, come back into an extremely painful body that I think took him 2 years to rehab. But I just love, I'm just going to share the first line that came out of his mouth. I'm Daniel Brinkley and was a bad boy. What I'm saying is, what kind of mean son of a bitch gets hit by lightning 3 times before he gets the message? So I remember that was the first word out of his mouth. And this is a guy who got hit 3 times and then came back and I believe started many, many hospice for veterans, because everyone comes back fearless because they realize there's no such thing as death in a way, and there's no such thing as fear, really. So, and then there's another famous, really intricate case called Mellon Thomas Benedict. And he was someone who died for an hour and a half clinically from a terminal brain cancer situation. And he, as he was getting close to death, he didn't believe in God or source, and he didn't really care, but he started studying spirituality profusely. And so when he crossed over and was a little confused, and before he stepped fully into the light, he kind of went, wait, I have a question I want to ask. And the question, he saw the light, and I'm going to quote this, I was before the light and asked, are you God? The light is really the oversoul matrix of our system, I found out, and the sum total of everything we have ever been to this point. It is itself evolving as we are evolving. So the light automatically knows you. It knows you individually and discreetly because your light is a direct part of it. I call it the Great Self. And it speaks to you directly in a way that you will understand. So when I asked the light, are you God? The light said to me, who and what is not God? Stop trying to become God. God is becoming you here. So the light explained to him that there is no death, that we are immortal beings, that we have always been alive forever. And he realized that he was part of a natural living system that recycles itself endlessly. He said, quote, people don't realize how positive even today's current situation is, and future generations will see us as heroic. The light insulated me from all that fear and pain. That is what hell really is, your fear and pain. So what we are doing now is learning to hold hands at this time in Earth's history, to come together. We are going to link up, hold hands, and walk out of, quote, hell, unquote, together into a new world.
Beautiful. In concluding, I would like to let your audience know how they can see my film and some other interesting things. Easiest way is to go to my website, newscience2020.com. New Science, that's one word, newscience2020.com. You'll see my films up there and articles and interviews and so on. And you can contact me through that website.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming.
Thank you,
I
Marilyn.
really appreciate it. I always have so much fun with you. And folks, thank you for joining in and being curious about gaining greater truth and greater wisdom in the big picture viewpoint. In 2 weeks, September 3rd, I'm going to continue in the same vein, and we'll be giving you the latest uplifting wisdom of how reincarnation works and what karma really is. So until then, upward and onward.
Hear all of our previously aired broadcasts of News for the Soul online at newsforthesoul.com. Now let's get back to the show.